My friends, Israel has waited, patiently waited, for the international community to resolve this issue. We've waited for diplomacy to work. We've waited for sanctions to work. None of us can afford to wait much longer. As Prime Minister of Israel, I will never let my people live in the shadow of annihilation.
Quite so. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, he met with President Obama, but assurances given over Iran, were they, weren't they? What is likely to happen in the coming months? Daniel Pipes is perhaps the most astute and informed commentator on the Middle East out there right now. And he joins us by Skype from Zurich, Switzerland. Welcome to you, sir.
Thank you, Michael.
Now, it's very hard to know what really went on behind closed doors. We know that Netanyahu and Barack Obama are not the closest of friends, but what do you think was said between the two men?
Well, may I start by giving you my concerns about how much we know? First, I think that a lot of what is being told publicly is not for your and my consumption, but for the Iranians, and it might be disinformation. And secondly, presumably both of them are not showing everything, their complete hand. So we don't know quite what we know and what we don't know. That said, there seems to be a tension over the fact that the Israeli capabilities are lesser than the American ones. Israel is closer to Iran, and therefore the Israelis feel a constraint of time that's more urgent than the Americans do. And therefore the U.S. government, in the person of Barack Obama, is asking the Israelis to wait. And the Israelis are not eager to let the moment pass when they can effectively target the Iranian nuclear infrastructure and then depend on the Americans. That is what we understand to be the tension. But I would note to you that the Israelis have means beyond what is conventionally discussed. Not only do they have fighter planes that could send bombs against the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, but they themselves have nuclear weapons, which they could, as a doomsday weapon, deploy. So, again, I don't know what we know and what we don't know. It's a very difficult issue to discuss.
Mm-hmm. Now, we hear from many Iranians who are sincerely opposed to the regime in Tehran, pleading with Israel not to attack militarily. They say that the mass of Iranian people are still pro-Israel, they can't stand the regime, and if you attack, it will unify support for the hardliners. But I can't see the alternative that Israel really has. That may or may not be true, but it can't wait until Iran builds up an even greater arsenal.
Well, that points to the drawbacks of an attack on Iran, the impact on the population's outlook, the price of oil, terrorism taking place here and there around the world, all sorts of nasty implications. But they have to be weighed against the possibility of the mullahs in Tehran having nuclear weapons. Which would you rather less? I would say the latter. I would take myself the risk of the lesser repercussions and avoid the greater danger of them having nuclear weapons, particularly since the leadership in Iran has an apocalyptic mindset and might use weapons of mass destruction in order to bring on the end of days. A terrifying prospect.
Yes, it is. How much of this is dependent on what happens in Syria, which I suppose is Iran's closest ally in the Arab world? If Assad does fall, will that change the equation?
I think the fall of Assad has a couple of implications. One is that the Iranians no longer can make trouble in Lebanon, Israel, and surrounding areas in the way they can now because they lose their main ally there. And secondly, and more speculatively, the collapse of the Assad regime could prompt the Iranians to think, well, the Syrians can do it, why can't we? The allies of the Iranian regime could fell, so why not the Iranian regime itself? It could. It's very difficult sort of thing to predict, but I would expect to be more in the air after the Assad regime is gone than it is at present.
Now, that's a very interesting point, because in Syria there's a certain ambivalence, Alawites and Christians and so on, who may not enormously support Assad, but they're frightened of the alternative. in Iran, surely there is a large number of unified people who do think this Tehran government does not represent their interests, whether they're secular, regional, non-Persian, and so on.
Exactly. The numbers that one gets of Iranians who are disaffected from the regime, be they Sunnis, be they Turkic speakers, be they seculars, be they whatever, it tends to be very large. I had a soft figure the other day of 85%. I don't know, I believe that quite, but it is substantial. The regime in Iran is unpopular. It is there through repression. That repression can only go so far. It could be that the collapse of the Syrian regime would prompt something in Iran. So we're in a position of great flux at this moment, and so much is taking place. Very hard to predict.
Last question: If it did happen, if it did come to a military attack, obviously there's so much here we can't predict. But is it likely to be successful, and is it likely that mass civilian casualties, at least, will be avoided?
The success or failure is difficult for me to say. In particular, I don't know all the details. But I think the Israelis have some very advanced avionics and weaponry. And, you don't have to destroy all the centrifuges. You, for example, can block off the tunnels to get access to them. And you've already made it, you've put back the program by quite a bit. Will there be many civilian casualties? Probably not, because unless they use nuclear weapons, these facilities tend to be isolated. The Iranians would be happy to put them in the middle of cities, but they're not doing that for technical reasons. The facilities are quite isolated, so I don't think there would be large numbers of casualties should there be conventional, should the attack be with conventional forces.
Yeah. Fascinating times. We'd love to have you back on the show before very long. As always, a great pleasure. Thank you, my friend.
Good talk to you.